In this video, I'm going to explain what all the buttons on your camera do so that you're familiar with them. As we go through my tutorials, this will enable you to find the right button. So if you're in any doubt, now is the time to dig out your camera's manual or download it from the internet. I'm Richard Gill and I'm a professional photographer, specialising in architecture, property, commercial photography and video for businesses. I provide free photography training for beginners, especially if you're a bit older like me, those of us with a bit of grey in our hair or maybe not much hair left at all. I post weekly videos every Friday showing you how to better understand your camera, how to compose and edit your photos so the image you had in your head when you took that photo matches what you see when you press the shutter. If that sounds like you, then hit that subscribe button and join our community. Remember to click the bell also so you get notified when I release a new video. And if you stay to the end of this video, I've got a top tip for you on using one particular program mode on your camera. Let's get started and look at all those buttons on your camera. This is going to be different for different makes of models of camera, but you should have many of the same buttons. I'm going to show you two examples, a Nikon D7500 DSLR and a Sony A7 III mirrorless camera. But do let me know in the comments what camera you're using, and then I can include details for your make and model in future videos. If we take a bird's eye view, so that's looking down on the top of your camera body, you're likely to see some of the following buttons: an on-off switch, a mode dial button, the shutter release button, and maybe an exposure compensation button or dial. Perhaps also some custom function buttons. This is the top of my Nikon D7000. It also includes a metering button. And on the side of the mode dial, there is a release button to allow you to select some shutter controls, such as if you want to use a remote control or setting the shutter to be in a continuous mode. On my Sony A7, I don't have those buttons there. They're buried into a menu system. But I do have two buttons that I can customize for features that I might use on a regular basis. These are C1 and C2. Let's have a look at the front of the camera now. First of all, I have a command dial. I have a function button which I can program to a feature that I want to use regularly. I have a depth of field preview button. I'll explain more about that when we get into talking about apertures in a future video. I have a focus select button, allowing me to switch the focus from autofocus to manual. And a button to release the lens when I want to change the lens for a different type. There's also a couple of other buttons. One is to activate the pop-up flash, and the other one, which has got BKT printed in, is for bracketing exposures. Again, we'll get into bracketing exposures when we talk about using different apertures and why we should want to do that. The Sony A7 has less buttons on the front. It literally just has a command dial and a button to release the lens, because it has put a lot of its functions in the menu system. On the back of the camera, there are a number of other buttons. There is another command dial wheel. There's also a small button to adjust the focus in the viewfinder. This is to compensate for your eyes. For example, if you need glasses and you use the viewfinder without your glasses, then by turning this little dial, you can get it so that it's in focus in your viewfinder. There's also an exposure lock button and a focus lock button. A playback button so you can look at the last image you took. And obviously the menu button, which brings up all the other functions that the camera has to offer. There are also a number of other buttons for selecting particular functions like white balance, ISO and quality. Then there is this main command dial button, the movie record button and a live view button. Also another autofocus lock button and an info button which displays information on the screen on the back of the camera according to what mode the camera is in at the time. You can see similar function buttons on my Sony A7. There is a menu button, a focus lock button and an exposure lock button. A main command dial, a delete button, a playback button as well as a function button and another small command dial joystick. There are a couple of other areas to discuss. On the side, there's usually a place where you can insert your memory card or cards. And on the bottom is the battery compartment. On the opposite side, you'll see you have a number of connectors. This allows you to charge your battery, for example, output your images to your PC or to a computer and display them on that. Also inputs for things like a microphone or headphones for when you're recording video. So take a bit of time now, get to know what those buttons do, figure out if they rotate or if you have to press them, and see what function that changes. See if there's something comes up on the display of your camera or in the viewfinder. As I say, now's probably a good time to have a look in your manual or just download one from Google with a quick search if you don't have the manual available. I'm going to talk now about a few things you should do to set up your camera. Let's talk about the card slots. You might have one or you might have two card slots. If you have just the one SD card slot, then you can ignore what I'm going to say next. If you have two slots, either two SD card slots or perhaps a combination of an SD card and a CF card, then I'd recommend setting one of the slots to be a backup. That's usually described in the menu as slot 2. What this means is if one of your cards gets corrupted or fails for some reason, then you've got a backup of your photos on the second card. Imagine if you've been on holiday for a week and lost all your photos because your card had failed. You'll be really pleased that you had that second backup. The second thing I would recommend is that you set the quality of the image to RAW. That's R-A-W. Now, why do I say choose RAW? It's because RAW files are all the data that is captured on your camera when it takes a photo. So everything the sensor sees is captured into that RAW file. The beauty of that is that you've got all that data, so at a later point when you get into editing and processing your photos, you can manipulate it in the best ways possible because you've got everything to play with. Now, for example, if you'd made a mistake and got one of your camera settings wrong, when you come to edit the photos, you can actually adjust that in software like Photoshop to compensate for that error you made. The alternatives you have are usually to set it in a JPEG format, and it'll probably give you a mixture of JPEG qualities from fine to low. And I would always recommend choosing the highest quality so that you get most of the data that you're using. One of the drawbacks of a JPEG file is that the camera does some processing on the image, and because of that you lose a tiny bit of the quality. So if you're serious about taking photography as a hobby, at some point you're going to get into processing your photos. And as long as you've got those raw files, when you come to do that processing, you'll be able to do what you want with them. If you think, oh, I'm never going to process my photos, then it's okay just to save them as JPEGs. The advantage of saving them as JPEGs is it saves you a bit of space, so you can have smaller memory cards, which are a little bit cheaper. But honestly, memory cards are so cheap now, I don't know why you wouldn't want to use raw files. And if you're really going to get into photography, then you should really think about processing your photos. One of the things you could do as a compromise would be to save a JPEG and a RAW. So you've got both options. For the time being, when you're not into or not ready to process your photos, you've got a good selection of your photos as JPEGs, which you can enjoy. And then at a later stage, you've still got that backup of the RAW files, which you can start processing when you feel you're ready to do it. So for those of you who think Photoshop or processing your photos is cheating, let me give you my take on it. So I grew up on film and I then processed it in a darkroom. And that's what my view is of digital processing. You take a picture on your camera, that's just the same as you would taking a picture with a film in there, except you're just saving it onto a memory card. Now afterwards, I transformed that using a couple of bits of software called Lightroom and Photoshop And that's exactly the same process as I would have done in a darkroom. And to me, it's a big part of the creative process. If you look at some of the very famous photographers in the past, they manipulated their photographs a lot in the darkroom. So you're just doing the same as some of the great photographers have done throughout history. So that's my view of it. Getting back to some of the options that I think you might find useful to set up on your camera. So if you do have this option, I would recommend that you turn the viewfinder grid display on. And this will put a little grid in your viewfinder which will help you with composition. It's usually somewhere in one of the display menus. You may also have an option to set color space. The color space I recommend you choose at this time is sRGB. There are a few other little things that probably should be set correctly already, but if they're not, just check that your white balance is set to auto, and that if you do have the option for picture profiles, I would turn all those off. Basically, picture profiles put a look or a bit like an Instagram filter onto your photo. And what we really want to start with is what we've actually seen and what the camera has actually captured, not something that's been manipulated to give it a particular look. Right, so let's now look at the main dial, the mode selection dial. On here, you're likely to have several options, and these should be pretty similar for all makes and models of camera. You will have an M mode, which usually means manual, an A mode for aperture priority, an S, which is for shutter priority, a P for program, probably an auto mode, which is a fully automatic mode, and then you probably have something that says something like SCN or scene, where the camera has a number of pre-selected scene modes. And you might have a couple of user selection modes. There might be U1 or U2 as shown on the top of this Nikon, or it might just say 1 or 2 or something like that. So what do all these modes mean? Well, throughout these tutorial videos, I'm going to explain how you use those different modes and get you out of using the automatic and program modes so that you take control of the picture you're taking, not the camera. So let's start with the most advanced mode, if you like, for the camera taking the picture, the auto mode. Here, the camera is going to take every decision for you. It's going to decide what aperture to use, what shutter to use, what ISO to use, what white balance, everything. It's going to optimize all the controls so that it thinks it's got the best picture. Now, don't worry if you don't understand what all these aperture, shutter and so on mean. I will explain them in my next video. But I just want you to get the idea of where it is on your camera and what that dial means. Let's talk next about program mode. This is very similar to auto mode. It just gives you a little bit of manual control yourself. So it'll allow you to set 1 or 2 of the parameters, probably like ISO or white balance. But it's a very good mode for grabbing a snapshot in. So S stands for shutter priority. So this is where you have the option to set the shutter speed, and in a later video I'll explain why you'd want to do that and what shutter speed you'd select. And then the camera will choose an aperture to make sure that the photo is correctly exposed. The next mode is A, which stands for aperture control. In a similar way, you set the aperture you want, and again I'll explain that in the next video. And in this case, the camera will choose an appropriate shutter speed to ensure that the photo is correctly exposed. So the next mode is M for manual. Now this is the mode that scares most learner photographers, but once you get the hang of it, it'll be a mode that you use probably most of your time. What it does is it allows you to select everything. It allows you to choose your aperture and it allows you to choose your shutter speed. And you have to make the decision as to what they should be to ensure your photo is correctly exposed. Finally, let's talk about the few other options there are. So scene Scene is very like the program and auto modes that we mentioned at the beginning, but here the camera is going to set itself up for particular lighting conditions. So for example, if you wanted to take a sunset, then you can select the sunset scene and the camera will optimize its settings to match that lighting condition. Similarly, you'll find there's one for portraits, there's one for taking pictures of flowers, all sorts of different ones, landscape, ones for taking pictures in the dark and low light, and so on. So it's if you like, it's a way of taking the auto mode a stage further so that you're actually giving it some more input into the camera, telling it, look, I know what I'm going to do. I'm just about to take a portrait of this person. Please will you make sure you've got the right settings to make this portrait look good, or this sunset look good, or whatever other scene you're in. Now, the other options that we mentioned were the user programmable ones, which might be U1 or U2, or just a simple 1 or 2. Now these are so that if you have a particular photo that you take a lot and you always use the same settings, you can set that U1 button or U2 button to have those particular settings. So that's a very quick way of setting up your camera in a format with the aperture and shutter speed exactly as you want them for that particular type of scene that you take a lot. So it's just a shortcut, if you like. So that's it for this video. What I would recommend you do now, go out and take some photographs and try out the P mode, the auto mode and the scene modes and see how they work. Just get used to using your camera, get used to playing with the different buttons and seeing what effect they have, and look at your images that you take and see what effect it's had on the final image. Let me know in the comments anything that you struggled with, and I'll try and answer your questions and point you in the right direction. If you stayed to the end, I also said I'll give you a top tip, and this is for using one of the particular modes. Just before I do that, if you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button and join our community. Remember to click that bell so you get notified when I release a new video. So my top tip is to use the P mode. Even as a professional photographer, I still sometimes use that P mode, particularly for things like street photography, or maybe where you're going to a party or in an event where you know a moment might just happen and you don't get any warning of it, so you don't have time to set up your camera in advance. So you have to be really quick and you just want to grab that special moment. And if you're messing around with different camera settings, by the time you press the shutter, you probably miss that particular moment. In the P mode, your camera will choose a good selection of aperture and shutter speed and allow you to get a correctly exposed photo without you having to think about it or waste any time. So literally, you should be able to grab that perfect snapshot. So don't forget to subscribe and come back and see my next video where I'll be talking about light and how that influences your photos. I'll explain to you what aperture and shutter speed is and how to use them. And hopefully, in the meantime, go and get some great photos, have some fun with your camera, and I'll see you next time.